The dog at the riverbank. James Holloway had always found solace by the river. It was his place of peace, a quiet stretch of water far enough from town to provide a sense of solitude, but close enough for him to visit regularly. Every evening, as the sun began to dip beneath the horizon, James would cast his line into the gentle current, enjoying the serene sounds of nature. The cool breeze, the rustling leaves, and the occasional splashing of a fish jumping. It was his escape. But this evening, something felt different. James stood by the water's edge, his arms crossed as he gazed downriver. The last remnants of sunlight painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, casting a golden glow over the rippling surface. The pines lining the opposite shore swayed gently in the wind, and the air was crisp with the scent of pine and earth. But despite the beauty of the moment, something had caught his attention. A golden retriever, sitting perfectly still by the water, stared out across the river. Its fur glistened in the fading light, and it remained motionless, its gaze fixed intently on the water. James furrowed his brow, unsure of what had drawn him to notice the dog at first. It had been there every evening this week, but tonight, its stillness felt more pronounced, as though the dog was waiting for something or someone. James had seen plenty of stray dogs over the years, especially around the river. Some wandered near the water, searching for scraps or hoping for a kind soul to feed them. But this dog was different. It wasn't scruffy or hungry looking. It was well-groomed, with a shiny coat, and wore a red collar around its neck. But the strangest thing was that the collar had no tags. Whoever owned this dog clearly cared for it. But for some reason, it wasn't there. James glanced around. No one else was near, not along the bank or down the nearby trail. He was used to solitude out here, but tonight, the feeling of isolation seemed a little more intense. The dog's unblinking stare unnerved him. "Hey there, boy," James called softly, but the dog didn't respond. It flicked its ears but didn't move a muscle. James crouched down beside his tackle box, reeling in his line. He tried to shake off the odd sensation, focusing back on his fishing. But no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, his eyes kept drifting back to the retriever. For days, the dog had been coming to this spot at dusk, sitting by the water as if waiting for something. It was too regular, too intentional. James found himself wondering why a dog would choose such a precise spot every evening, and why it always sat there in silence. No barking, no sniffing around like most dogs did. "Who are you waiting for, huh?" James muttered under his breath as he packed up his fishing gear. His curiosity was getting the best of him. Normally, he wouldn't get involved in matters that didn't concern him, but this situation felt different. There was something about the dog's calm demeanor, its focused attention on the river, that tugged at him. As James slung his tackle box over his shoulder, he glanced one last time at the retriever. The dog still hadn't moved, its eyes locked on the water, almost as if it was anticipating something. Someone on the other side. The next day, James couldn't shake the image of the dog sitting by the river. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like an odd coincidence. Dogs didn't typically sit still like that unless they were waiting for something. The more he puzzled over it, the more a plan began to form in his mind. He couldn't just ignore it anymore. Tomorrow, he decided, he would follow the dog. The following evening, James arrived earlier than usual. He was determined to observe the dog more closely, to figure out what it was doing at the river every night. He set up his fishing gear as usual, but this time, he kept his attention sharply focused on the trail leading from the main road. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, James felt the familiar tension in his chest, anticipation, curiosity, and a little unease. Just as he had hoped, the golden retriever trotted down the same dirt path leading toward the river, its tail swaying in a steady rhythm. It reached its usual spot, sitting down by the water's edge and staring intently at the current. But this time, there was something different. The dog's eyes weren't just fixed on the water. They darted to the left, scanning the trees on the opposite bank. It wasn't just sitting there, it was searching. James' curiosity spiked. The dog was looking for something, maybe someone. It wasn't just waiting anymore, it was looking. And in that moment, James made a decision. "All right, boy. Let's see where you go," he whispered to himself. He quickly packed up his fishing gear, leaving his truck behind. The dog didn't seem to notice him as he followed from a distance, careful to stay out of sight. The dog moved with purpose, weaving through trees and over fallen logs, as if it knew exactly where it was going. James stayed a few paces behind, watching the retriever lead him deeper into the woods. After several minutes, they reached a small clearing. There, nestled among the trees, was an old wooden house, its porch light flickering dimly in the twilight. The dog walked up the steps and sat by the door, just like it had done by the river. It didn't bark, didn't paw at the door. It just sat there, waiting. James felt a strange unease ripple through him. He approached the house cautiously, stepping lightly on the worn wooden porch. The dog didn't move, still sitting, waiting. James hesitated for a moment before gently reaching for the door handle. To his surprise, it turned easily in his hand. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit living room. The furniture inside was neat, almost too neat, like someone had just stepped out and forgotten to lock the door behind them. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. It felt empty, abandoned, yet strangely untouched. "Hello," James called softly, stepping inside. The dog trotted past him without a glance, heading straight down a narrow hallway. With his heart pounding in his chest, James followed. At the end of the hall was a bedroom door, slightly ajar. The dog nudged the door open with its nose and disappeared inside. James stood in the doorway, staring into the room. It was just as neat as the rest of the house, almost unnervingly so. The bed was made, the nightstand tidy, a book resting on it with the bookmark halfway through. But the air felt stale, as if no one had been here in a long time. Then, on the dresser, something caught his eye, a framed photograph. He picked it up, and his breath caught in his throat. The photograph showed the same golden retriever sitting beside a man, older, perhaps in his late 60s. They were both smiling, the sunlight casting a warm glow over their faces. The caption read, "Max and Henry, best fishing buddies." James frowned. He didn't know anyone named Henry around here. He was familiar with the regulars along the river, but none of them had a dog like this. "Where's Henry, buddy?" James asked, turning to look at the dog, who was now curled up on the bed, resting its head on a pillow. The retriever didn't move, it just lay there, eyes half closed. James set the photo down and rubbed his face. Something didn't feel right. His gut told him that something was off about the situation, and as he turned to leave the room, the sinking feeling in his chest deepened. Max, the dog, had been waiting by the river for a reason, and now James was about to discover why. The dog's secret path. The next evening, the sky was painted in hues of orange and gold as James made his way back to the river. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts about the dog, the old house, and the strange sense of foreboding that had clung to him after his discovery. There was something undeniably unsettling about that place, and the retriever's strange behavior was only adding to the mystery. James arrived earlier than usual, determined to uncover more of the dog's odd routine. He set up his fishing gear near the same stretch of riverbank, pretending to focus on his task while his eyes continuously flicked toward the dirt path leading up to the spot where the retriever had first appeared. The quiet, tranquil setting now felt heavier, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. Just as the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the river, James saw the familiar golden retriever trotting down the path toward the water. It was as though the dog had been expecting him, arriving at exactly the same time as the night before. This time, however, something was different. The dog didn't settle right down like it had on previous evenings. Instead, it paused at the river's edge, its head turning back and forth, scanning the woods on the opposite shore with an intensity that James hadn't seen before. For the first time, the dog's attention wasn't solely focused on the river. Its eyes darted nervously between the trees, and its body tensed with anticipation. There was a quiet urgency in its movements. Something wasn't right. It wasn't simply sitting and waiting anymore. It was searching, as if it was looking for someone or something that wasn't there. James' heart raced as he watched. He couldn't resist the pull of curiosity any longer. He decided, with a firm nod to himself, that tonight he would follow the dog. Keep his distance, but stay close enough to see where it went. There was more to this than he could understand, and the dog seemed to be the key to uncovering it. "Let's see where you go, boy," James muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he packed up his gear, moving quickly but quietly. The dog's tail was wagging slightly now, but it still didn't approach James. Instead, it turned around and began walking up the trail, its body moving with purpose. It seemed to know exactly where it was headed. The rhythm of its steps was steady, confident. It wasn't wandering aimlessly. It was heading somewhere familiar. James picked up his pace, staying a few paces behind. His footsteps were muffled by the thick undergrowth of the forest, and he kept an eye on the dog, trying to remain out of sight. The retriever moved nimbly through the woods, effortlessly dodging branches and fallen logs, moving like it had been down this path 100 times before. The trail twisted through the trees, and soon the sounds of the river were replaced by the whisper of wind through the leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets. The air grew cooler, the dense forest enveloping James in its quiet stillness. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, as though he were walking through a place that was far more significant than it seemed at first glance. After several minutes, the dog came to a small clearing. James paused just behind a thick tree trunk, peeking around it to see what the retriever had found. Ahead, through the mist of the fading daylight, he could make out the silhouette of an old wooden house tucked away in the clearing. Its porch light was flickering dimly, casting an eerie glow over the front steps. The house appeared weathered, as if it had been untouched for years, and yet there was an unsettling sense of familiarity in the scene. The dog didn't hesitate. It padded up the steps, its tail swinging in a calm but steady rhythm, and sat down at the door. Just like it had done by the river, the dog sat motionless, staring at the door as if waiting for something or someone to appear. There was a stillness in the air that seemed to press against James, making the back of his neck prickle with unease. James stood in the shadows, watching the dog. He was close now, but the retriever hadn't noticed him. His curiosity was overpowering. He had to know more. He couldn't shake the feeling that the house was the key to all of this. The dog's odd behavior, its regular visits to the river, its unwavering vigil by the door. A soft, almost imperceptible whine escaped the retriever, and it pressed its nose against the door, looking up at it with what could only be described as longing. There was no bark, no frantic scratching. The dog's patience was palpable. It was waiting for something only it seemed to understand. James approached cautiously, stepping lightly on the creaking porch boards. He was careful not to disturb the dog, who remained still, unwavering in its position. He reached for the door handle, his fingers brushing the cool metal. The door turned easily in his hand, and with a quiet creak, it swung open. The interior of the house was dimly lit, and the air smelled of old wood and dust. It felt strange to be standing in a place that had been untouched for so long, yet there was no sign of decay. The house seemed frozen in time, as if someone had just stepped out moments ago and forgotten to lock the door behind them. The retriever padded past him without a glance, trotting down the hallway. James hesitated at the threshold, his mind racing. He wasn't sure why he had crossed the line into this strange home, but something inside urged him to follow the dog. He took a deep breath and stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The house was still, as if it were waiting with him. James followed the dog down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. At the end of the hall, He saw a bedroom door slightly ajar. The retriever nudged it open with its nose and disappeared inside, leaving James standing in the doorway, unsure of what he was about to discover. With cautious steps, he followed the dog into the room. The room was neat, almost unnervingly so. The bed was made, the nightstand was organized, and a book lay open with a bookmark halfway through. But the atmosphere in the room felt stale, abandoned. The air carried the unmistakable weight of something lost, of someone who had been gone for a long time. The retriever had jumped onto the bed, curling up on a pillow as if it had been its resting place for years. James stared at the dog, his heart pounding. He felt a strange connection, like the dog was part of something larger, a story that had yet to be fully told. Then his eyes landed on a framed photograph on the dresser. He picked it up slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The photograph showed the same golden retriever beside a man who appeared to be in his late 60s, smiling contentedly in the sun. The caption read, "Max and Henry, best fishing buddies." James felt a tightness in his chest. He didn't recognize the name Henry. He knew the regulars on the river by name, but there was no Henry among them. Something about this felt off, too much of a coincidence. He set the photo down, turning his attention back to the retriever. "Where's Henry, buddy?" he murmured. The dog didn't move. It just lay there, eyes closed, as though it had heard the question 1,000 times before and didn't need to answer. James swallowed, his stomach sinking. Something was wrong, and he knew it. The pieces weren't fitting together, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that he had stumbled upon something far bigger than he had intended. The dog's vigil at the river, the abandoned house, the photograph, it was all connected. James stood still for a moment, his mind racing. He couldn't ignore his gut instinct anymore. Something was missing, and he had to find out what it was. The dog had been waiting, patiently, for a reason, and now James was about to uncover the truth. The unanswered question. James couldn't tear his eyes away from the golden retriever, Max, who lay so still on the bed. His breathing was slow and steady, his form relaxed as though the dog had found some kind of comfort in the abandoned room. But for James, every second in that room felt heavier, leaden with the knowledge that something important, was missing. Max's peacefulness was at odds with the strange emptiness surrounding them. The room was too neat, too quiet, and yet the feeling of abandonment hung thick in the air, like a secret never spoken aloud. James stepped closer, his shoes barely making the sound on the old wooden floor. His heart was still pounding, the earlier sense of unease now mingling with an overwhelming curiosity. Who was Henry? Why had the dog been coming to the river every evening, waiting for someone who never arrived? And why had it led him here, to a house that felt abandoned, yet everything inside was untouched, frozen in time? The answer was somewhere in this room. James was sure of it. His gaze drifted back to the photograph on the dresser. He reached for it again, this time holding it in his hands longer, really studying it. The man in the photo, a smiling older gentleman with a weathered face, wearing a fishing hat, seemed so familiar, yet James couldn't place him. The caption beneath the photo read, "Max and Henry, best fishing buddies." That was all. No last name. No additional information. The photo was simply a moment frozen in time, a happy memory, but it felt disconnected from the present. James' fingers brushed the edge of the frame, his mind racing as he turned over possibilities. Why would a dog be so committed to returning to a place like this, day after day without its owner? Why had it led him here? And why hadn't anyone else noticed? The longer he stood in the room, the more the house seemed to close in on him. It was as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. And then it hit him. The house wasn't just empty, it was forgotten. It wasn't that the owner had just left for a trip. It was as if they had disappeared altogether, leaving behind a life that had continued without them. Max, still on the bed, shifted slightly, his tail giving a small thump against the pillow. It was a subtle sound, but it brought James back to reality. The retriever's eyes were half-lidded, but it seemed to be aware of his presence, watching him without moving. "Max, where is he?" James whispered to the dog, his voice almost pleading. The question was simple, but the dog didn't answer. It only blinked, its gaze unwavering. Max had been waiting here every night for someone, but James didn't know if that someone was still alive, still coming back, or if this was just the final destination for both the dog and the memory of Henry. Suddenly, a distant sound broke the silence, a creak of wood outside, followed by the crunch of gravel underfoot. James froze, his senses on high alert. Someone was outside. Someone was coming. His heart raced as the sound of footsteps grew louder, drawing closer to the house. He had been so absorbed in the mystery of the house that he hadn't heard the approach. Without thinking, James moved swiftly to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see who it was. There in the growing darkness, he saw a figure walking toward the porch. The man was tall, wearing a plaid shirt and old boots, his face obscured by the shadows of the trees. It wasn't Henry. He didn't recognize this person, but the way the man walked toward the house, with a slow, deliberate pace, set off alarm bells in James' mind. Max, sensing the change in the atmosphere, rose from the bed. His tail wagged for a moment, then stiffened. The dog's body language was alert, tense, but not in a threatening way. Instead, it was as though Max had recognized the person approaching. James quickly stepped back from the window, trying to stay out of sight. He could hear the man's boots scraping against the wooden steps as he neared the porch. The dog didn't bark. It just stood by the door, waiting. The door creaked open, and the man stepped inside without knocking. He didn't seem surprised to find the door ajar, nor did he question why James was there. His eyes, though wary, seemed to carry a sense of familiarity when they landed on Max, who had trotted toward the man and was now sitting beside him. James didn't know what to do. He wasn't sure if he should confront this stranger, ask who he was, or if he was somehow connected to the house, or even Henry. But he felt the need to say something. His mind raced as he debated how to approach the situation without making things awkward or strange. Before James could speak, the man broke the silence. "Max has been waiting, hasn't he?" The man said softly, his voice carrying an emotion that James couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was something more profound, like sadness wrapped in acceptance. James stood still, watching him closely. The man's gaze shifted to James, then back to Max. "Yes," James finally answered, his voice tight. "The dog's been coming to the river every night. I followed him here." The man nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting something that seemed far beyond this moment. "I knew he was waiting. He always did. You see, Henry and I, we were partners, fishing buddies, like the photo says. But Henry isn't coming back. He passed away last year, unexpectedly. Max hasn't left this place since then. He's been waiting for him. He won't stop waiting." The words hit James like a ton of bricks. He felt his stomach tighten as the realization sank in. Max hadn't been waiting for a stranger to arrive. The dog had been waiting for its owner, Henry. The house, so seemingly abandoned and forgotten, was in fact the home of a man who had passed, leaving his loyal dog behind. James looked at Max, the golden retriever's eyes now full of a quiet understanding, as if it had known this day would come, but it was still trying to hold on to the past. The sense of loyalty in the dog's gaze struck James deeply, reminding him of the powerful bond that can exist between humans and their animals. "You were waiting for Henry, weren't you, boy?" James murmured, bending down to scratch behind Max's ears. The dog let out a soft sigh, nuzzling James's hand, as though the dog understood what was happening too. The man, who had introduced himself as Will, stepped forward, his gaze downcast. "I came to check on him, to make sure Max wasn't alone anymore. It's time for him to move on, but I think, for now, he needs closure." James nodded, his throat tight. He had seen many things in his life, but this This moment was one of the most moving things he had ever experienced. The dog's unshakable loyalty, its devotion to a past that could never return, had brought James here. And now, the truth was laid bare. "Max," James said softly, "it's okay now. You've been waiting long enough." The dog looked up at him, its eyes calm, as if it had finally understood. The waiting, the longing, it was over. And now, it was time to let go. As James stood there, watching Max, and will share a moment of silent understanding, he realized something profound. Sometimes, the hardest part of life is letting go of what we can't change. But even in that letting go, there's room for new beginnings, new paths to follow. And in that quiet moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the bond between man, dog, and memory felt like a lesson in the healing power of acceptance. For Max, it was no longer about waiting. It was about finding peace. The final goodbye. The air was heavy with the unsaid words as James watched Will and Max share that quiet moment. There was a stillness in the air, as if the world had paused, allowing them all the moment to come to terms with what had passed and what was left. Max, the golden retriever who had waited so patiently by the river for what felt like an eternity, had finally found peace, and with that, the healing process could begin. James stepped back, giving Will and Max the space they needed, his heart swelling with an unexpected tenderness. He had thought he was coming to the river to fish, to clear his mind and enjoy the solitude. Instead, he had been drawn into something far more profound, a bond between a dog and its owner that transcended time and loss. Will remained silent for a long while, just standing beside Max, his hand gently resting on the dog's head, as if they were both silently acknowledging the years they had spent together. The bond between them was palpable, and James could see that Max had, in his own way, come to accept the reality of Henry's absence. "I never thought I'd see him like this," Will finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Max, he used to wait by the river every night. I thought he'd never stop. He was waiting for me, or for Henry to return, but I think he knows now. He's ready to move on." James nodded, his eyes fixed on the dog. "It's been hard for him, I think," he said softly. "But sometimes, animals know things that we don't. They feel things, and they carry it with them until they're ready to let go." Will sighed, a wistful smile tugging at his lips. "I always thought Henry would be here to say goodbye to Max. But life doesn't always go the way we expect, does it?" James could see that Will's words held a deep sadness, but also a quiet acceptance. The man had lived with the weight of the past for so long, holding on to memories that now felt like a distant echo. The time had come for both him and Max to embrace the present, to let go of the ghosts of the past. "Max has waited long enough," James said, kneeling beside the dog. The golden retriever lifted his head, his eyes meeting James with a gentle gaze. It was as if the dog understood, as if it could sense the closure that had finally arrived. Will reached into his pocket and pulled out a small worn-out fishing lure. "This was Henry's favorite," he said, holding it out to Max. "He always used to say it brought him good luck. Maybe it'll bring Max some peace too." James watched quietly as Will attached the lure to the dog's collar, a simple yet significant gesture. It was the last piece of Henry that remained, and now it would stay with Max, a reminder of their unbreakable bond. Max seemed to relax even more, his body leaning into Will as if he was finally ready to let go of the past. The tension that had once gripped him was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of calm. As James stood up, he glanced at the river, the same river where Max had spent countless evenings waiting. The water shimmered softly in the fading light, a reminder of the passage of time. It was a place of reflection, of healing, and of release. "I think it's time," James said, his voice gentle. "Max is ready for a new chapter." Will nodded slowly, his eyes brimming with emotion. "Yeah," he whispered. "I think he is." With that, they all stood together, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant shades of red and gold. The river, once a place of waiting, now seemed to offer something more, a place of peace, of closure. Max, the dog who had waited so long, lifted his head one last time, as if to say goodbye to the past. Then he turned and walked toward Will, his tail wagging gently. It was as if the river had finally released him, and the weight of the past had lifted. James watched the dog and the man walk away, their silhouettes fading into the golden light of the evening. There was no more waiting, no more searching for something that could never return. The past was behind them, and the future, uncertain as it always was theirs to embrace. As James stood by the river, alone once more, he realized something. Life, like the river, flowed forward, sometimes carrying us with it whether we were ready or not. But it was the moments of understanding, of letting go, that truly shaped us. And sometimes we needed to wait, not for what we wanted, but for what we needed. Max had waited for his owner, for Henry, for a love and loyalty that could never be shaken. And now, as he walked away with Will, he had found his peace, and in that, there was a lesson for them all. James smiled softly, watching the last of the sun dip below the horizon. He didn't need to catch a fish tonight. The river had already given him something far more valuable. It had given him a reminder of what truly mattered: love, loyalty, and the courage to let go when the time was right. And with that, he turned, heading home, knowing that Max's journey had come full circle. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.